In a city where knowledge felt carefully arranged and respectfully bounded, even Battuta grew up sensing a strange paradox because while teachers spoke of completeness and order, his imagination kept drifting beyond walls, beyond familiar names, and toward places no one in the room seemed eager to imagine. This tension between being rooted in tradition and pulled by curiosity did not explode into rebellion, but instead settled quietly inside him, shaping the way he listened more than the way he spoke. When travelers passed through with weathered clothing and unfamiliar rhythms in their voices, he noticed how their presence shifted the air, and he felt an unspoken invitation hiding beneath polite greetings and cautious questions. Rather than longing for danger or glory, he felt drawn toward understanding, which made his curiosity feel both noble and risky, especially when responsibility whispered that contentment should already be enough. In gatherings filled with conversation, Ibn Battuta often found himself observing from a thoughtful distance, absorbing the way people adjusted themselves depending on audience, as if identity itself were a subtle form of travel. This habit of quiet watching gave him a sensitivity that others mistook for hesitation, even though his mind was busy mapping connections between customs, emotions, and the invisible rules guiding behavior. There was gentle humor in realizing that a young man trained in sacred law could still feel uncertain about everyday belonging, especially when his thoughts wandered off midway through conversations toward unseen horizons. Writing offered him a private shelter, where reflections could wander freely and questions did not demand immediate answers, allowing his imagination to travel long before his body ever would. Each sentence he shaped carried movement, as if language itself were a vehicle capable of crossing distances while remaining safely anchored to home. He began to notice that belonging was not singular, because people carried multiple selves depending on place and company, a realization that unsettled him even as it quietly thrilled him. When elders spoke with confidence about paths already proven, Ibn Battuta listened respectfully, while sensing that certainty sometimes overlooked the quiet needs of a searching spirit. Rather than resisting guidance, he practiced patience, trusting that careful attention might prepare him for choices not yet visible. Small details fascinated him deeply, from the rhythm of marketplaces to subtle shifts in politeness between strangers, suggesting that the world spoke through gestures as much as words. These observations taught him that difference did not always announce itself loudly, but often revealed meaning through patterns waiting to be noticed. Though his youth denied him authority, it granted him freedom to remain unnoticed, a position he used to gather understanding rather than attention. Loneliness appeared early in his life, not as sorrow, but as a quiet space that sharpened awareness and allowed thoughts to echo more clearly. He discovered that standing slightly apart helped him see how communities held together, and how they sometimes quietly excluded what felt unfamiliar. At times, the idea of leaving frightened him, because curiosity offered no guarantees of safety, comfort, or approval. Faith remained his grounding presence, not limiting his imagination, but expanding his sense of connection across distant lands and unfamiliar faces. He began imagining journeys not as escapes from home, but as extended conversations with the wider world. The thought of travel grew gradually, feeling less like a decision and more like an unfolding truth he was slowly learning to accept. Friends imagined futures shaped by stability, while he carried invisible roots forming quietly behind his attentive gaze. This difference taught him restraint, because not every longing required explanation. He learned to smile easily, allowing courtesy to soften the weight of his unshared thoughts. Observation became his quiet skill, guiding interactions without demanding attention. Each conversation felt like practice for unfamiliar settings waiting beyond familiar roads. He wondered whether the world would welcome listeners as much as leaders. In still moments, landscapes formed gently behind his eyes, drawn more by curiosity than desire. Boundaries between places began to feel thinner than people claimed, as if separation were partly an agreement rather than a fact. Even fear became informative, offering insight rather than obstruction. He noticed how anticipation stretched time, making waiting itself an education. Patience slowly shaped intention, teaching him when to move and when to remain still. Curiosity matured into resolve, without hardening into pride. This resolve stayed gentle because force seemed less useful than understanding. He avoided heroic fantasies, sensing they simplified complex human journeys. Ordinary details held greater importance because they revealed how people truly lived. Preparation meant humility, rather than mastery. Have-heard stories fueled imagination without demanding belief. Uncertainty earned his gratitude because it kept his mind awake. He learned to remain alert without becoming restless. The pull outward never erased his love inward, but stretched it across imagined distances. Affection became broader rather than thinner. Youth passed quietly, without dramatic turning points. Readiness formed almost unnoticed, shaped by years of attention. Departure felt both distant and inevitable, resting patiently on the horizon. He carried questions carefully, as if they were companions. The road had not yet begun beneath his feet. Yet his attention was already traveling, step by thoughtful step. The moment movement finally entered his life, it arrived not with trumpets or declarations, but with a quiet inner adjustment, as if the world had gently leaned closer and asked whether he was ready to listen while walking. Each step away from familiarity felt both lighter and heavier, because freedom widened his senses even as responsibility pressed against his chest, reminding him that curiosity carried consequences along with wonder. Roads unfolded like slow sentences, teaching him that distance was not empty space, but a fabric woven from weather, voices, hospitality, and moments of unexpected kindness. Among strangers, his habit of careful observation transformed into a bridge, allowing him to move through unfamiliar customs without demanding immediate belonging. He learned quickly that listening earned trust more reliably than confidence, especially in places where words carried histories deeper than any single traveler could grasp. Fatigue sharpened his perception, turning discomfort into instruction rather than complaint, and teaching him how endurance often revealed truths hidden from the comfortable. At night, when shelters varied and silence felt unfamiliar, reflection replaced certainty, encouraging him to measure himself not against destinations, but against how attentively he had experienced the day. Encounters rarely followed expectation, because generosity appeared in unlikely forms, while danger sometimes wore ordinary faces, urging him to remain humble rather than fearless. Faith traveled beside him, quietly adapting to new surroundings, not dissolving into doubt, but expanding into a language shared across diverse rituals and familiar hopes. He began to notice that people everywhere balanced pride with vulnerability, performing identity while privately negotiating belonging, a pattern that made foreign places feel surprisingly intimate. Moments of fear arrived, especially when paths narrowed or advice conflicted, yet these moments clarified purpose rather than weakening resolve. The absence of comfort taught him presence, because hunger, cold, and uncertainty sharpened attention and prevented his thoughts from drifting too far ahead. Stories accumulated without effort, attaching themselves to scents, gestures, and pauses, waiting patiently for moments when memory would require careful tending. Writing transformed from refuge into responsibility, since recording experience felt like an obligation not to exaggerate wonder nor diminish struggle. He resisted shaping events into neat conclusions, understanding that truth often lived in the spaces between success and failure. Crowded cities offered lessons distinct from open roads, revealing how complexity multiplied when cultures overlapped, competed, and cooperated within narrow spaces. Rather than feeling lost, he felt expanded, as if identity were no longer a single point, but a collection of echoes shaped by each encounter. Humor found him unexpectedly, often in moments of misunderstanding, where shared confusion dissolved tension more effectively than shared language. Authority appeared differently everywhere, sometimes gentle, sometimes brittle, teaching him to adapt without surrendering respect or curiosity. He discovered that endurance depended less on strength than on flexibility, especially when plans unraveled under weather, politics, or simple human unpredictability. Patience became active rather than passive, guiding decisions during delays that tested intention more than endurance. The world resisted ownership, and he learned to accept that passing through did not require possession or conquest. Recognition followed him unevenly, arriving at times when he felt least prepared, reminding him that attention could be both useful and burdensome. Each departure carried a faint ache because connection formed quickly when attentiveness replaced expectation. Return was never simple, since memory altered familiarity even before new roads appeared. His sense of self grew layered, enriched by contradictions rather than clarified by certainty. Moments of solitude returned differently now, filled with accumulated voices rather than emptiness. The question of home softened, no longer demanding a single answer. He understood that learning did not travel in straight lines, but looped through repetition, mistake, and reassessment. Weather-tested resolve, yet also revealed landscapes that rewarded patience with silence and scale. Hospitality taught him responsibility, because receiving care created silent bonds requiring respect and remembrance. He learned when to speak and when to remain quiet, sensing that restraint preserved understanding. Time stretched during hardship, compressing during wonder, reshaping how value was measured. Expectation gave way to adaptability, without erasing intention. Movement ceased to feel exceptional, becoming instead a rhythm aligned with attention. Through observation, he gathered not trophies, but perspectives. Judgment softened, replaced by curiosity sharpened through exposure. Comparison lost usefulness, since each place demanded its own understanding. Gradually, experience formed a quiet authority, unannounced yet steady. He carried knowledge gently, aware that explanation could never fully replace presence. Stories waited patiently, shaped by responsibility rather than excitement. Memory organized itself around feeling rather than chronology. Even exhaustion contributed meaning, reminding him of human limits. Purpose matured without ceremony. Direction remained open, not fixed. The journey refused final definition, and still, the world invited listening.